Hey guys, what's up? It's RESG here for Literary Gladiators, and today I've got an interesting short story for you. Continuing on with the kind of horror slash, this is a little bit more horror, I think, than The House with the Clock in its Walls, which is what I reviewed last time. Um, so, in order to find this short story I'll be going over today, you would have to go to the Twilight Zone 50th Anniversary Anthology for this one. And this short story is called "The Wrong Room." The interesting thing about "The Wrong Room" is it is by R.L. Stine, who is of Goosebumps fame and Fear Street fame and stuff like that. So automatically, it's a prestigious author. But let's see, how he did with this story. So let me go over the premise first. So there is a man named Sam Metchling. He is a, salesman, and he goes to a hotel and everything is just entirely wrong. He gets there, the things are already wrong with the room. Suddenly a prostitute turns up to his room, and it's like, wait a minute, no, this isn't the right room. And then it's like, oh well, he tries to call the operator and tell them what's going on, and the operator's just not responding, and he's being very, deliberately ignorant. He goes to the ballroom where his sales convention's supposed to be. It turns out it's entirely the wrong convention. He has a different color badge than the rest of the people there, and he doesn't recognize any of the names of the people there. And then eventually, at the end, he tries to get out of the hotel by leaving, but the door is locked. And there are key phrases that are, repeated by a lot of the staff. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. It's like, oh, there'll be, I know what it is. It'll be a different view in an hour. That's something that was repeated. There will be a different view in an hour. But Sam Metchling, he basically gets to all this stuff, and he believes that he is actually, in hell. All these things that are wrong, he believes it's like some scientific conspiracy that he's in hell. He's been, listening to science fiction theories, and he believes that if he just, he keeps going back to this wrong room every time something happens. So he feels that if he were to just, oh, if I die here in this room, I'll just keep going and going and going because it's hell. You can't die in hell. And then of course, eventually what winds up happening is he jumps out the window and kills himself. But the thing is that the left turn about this whole thing is that this was actually set up by his coworkers to be a test, albeit a very sadist test, but a test to see if he deserved a promotion or not for his new position. And it's kind of a interesting, way of putting that. And at the end, the last line of the whole story is, "Hey, the window's open," and you can just, and then it has the little, ending line like that Rod Serling would speak. Now, I would say that this story by far definitely resembles more the 80s Twilight Zones rather than the 60s and 50s ones. This definitely sounds like a story. As a matter of fact, a lot of stories in this anthology tend to lean towards the 1980s horror based Twilight Zones rather than the 50 and 60s ones, which were more about the left turn, the sudden left turn, even had some science fiction elements. 80s Twilight Zone, for the most part, was pretty much horror based, and I feel that these stories hit more on that. Now, of course, there are some stories by Rod Rod Serling himself, after he posthumously, and then Robert Serling as well. So, I mean, there are some ones out there that but the majority of these, especially with R.L. Stine, he's known for writing horror. He's going to have one that's more horror based. So, going on a review of this, it's not the greatest, but it's not the worst. I feel obviously with R.L. Stine being the writer, you can tell that the horror implications of the entire thing are much more than the left turn. The left turn is very weak in this one. Um, it's like, oh, it's just a joke, I mean, yes, they admit in the end that it was a very what's expensive joke, but I just can't imagine this being realistic. I mean, obviously, the great thing about the 60s Twilight Zones is that when you were presented with a situation, it felt like that was the situation and it actually was completely different. So, I'm not sure Stine did the greatest job with that. It's a very short story, so there isn't a lot of time for character development, but you can definitely tell Metzling is someone who watches a lot of science fiction, reads up on latest trends and theories, and he's like that kind of person. He's also a very nervous person with a lot of anxiety, and he's quick to jump to conclusions. As a matter of fact, that's what it said at the end. It said Metzling was a little too quick to jump out the window to conclusions. So obviously this is very psychological horror based, and for someone who has anxiety, I feel that this is a story that doesn't really, I mean, in some ways it portrays anxiety very well, and in others it's not great. I don't think in reality that someone would have gone to that extreme that quickly. But maybe that's just part of Metzling's personality. I just find it a little bit unbelievable. Now, the last time that I did a review of an R.L. Stine book, it was the first, possibly second, I don't remember. It's one of the only times I've ever given a goose egg, and that was because R.L. Stine, in that case, was trying to go into like a survival horror, or like, and he just wasn't great. Here, it's a little bit better. However, I find it really hard to give this any more than 2 stars out of 5, and that's being a little bit generous. Um, I mean, I was interested to see what R.L. Stine brought to the table in this anthology, and forgetting that it's Twilight Zone for a moment, like just keeping it in, you know, the realms of the story. I feel the character of Metzling is kind of an unrealistic type of character, although I do understand with the limitations of what to write about it. But when it comes to the anxiety that he's feeling when everything's wrong, I mean, even someone with severe OCD, like I sometimes have, would find it that jumping to death would be a very premature, you know. I mean, I understand, but this is just one day in this guy's life. And to immediately assume and jump to the conclusion that he's in hell, it does raise a lot of questions, especially since when he came into the place, he was going to a conference, which already was going to have a ton of people. The level of anxiety doesn't quite match. However, I do like about this story is kind of how it somewhat sets up. The more I talk about this, the more I'm starting to think that it's not even deserving of 2. Um, I might even drop it to a 1.5. It does have some interesting things to it, but the way it's portrayed by Stine, I'm not so sure. Stine, I think when it comes to short stories like this, he's usually pretty good, but this one was a little weak. Yeah, I'm actually going to give this 1.5, I think. However, that does not mean that the anthology itself is bad. I'm only reviewing one story because I was interested in looking at R.L. Stine's take. There are other very famous authors in here. Timothy Zahn has a thing in here. Kelly Armstrong, Mike Resnick, obviously Rod Serling has a posthumous entry here. And the interesting thing is that even though it talks a lot about the 60s Twilight Zones on the back of the books, I think you will get more out of this anthology if you are a fan of the 80s Twilight Zones, the horror ones. If you're a big fan of It's a Good Life, this one's probably for you. But if you're a fan of, oh, I don't remember the one. If you're a really big fan of Where Is Everybody or Time Enough at Last, this will not be for you. This is more A Good Life or the Dummy one, or ones that actually had horror implemented into it. Maybe I Have the Beholder. I suppose that's a bit of a stretch. But if you want more of a 60s version, I do have another anthology that has the episodes like written now, but or most of them are episodes, but they're not. Most of them are not original stories. But if you're into '80s Twilight Zone and horror, uh, but light horror, this is a good anthology to get. I'm thinking at some point of also reviewing Kelly Armstrong's story in this book, which I believe is entitled "A Haunted House of Her Own." It is. I'll do that another time. But for now, when it comes to The Wrong Room by R.L. Stine, I believe that R.L. Stine may have been in the wrong place when he did this one. It's not as good as Goosebumps. It's not as good, but it's not as bad as that survival horror that he did. At least has a general plot. At least he's trying to get the characters to make sense, and I feel that he does an adequate but could have done better job with the way story is. Again, I'm also forgiving this a little bit because it is a short story, only about 10 pages long, so you don't have the time that you have in a book like the survival horror one that he did. Like there's no excuse why that one should have been so bad. This one at least, it's a short story. It's not as long. Even saying that, I'm going to give The Wrong Room a 1.5 stars out of 5. It is like a lower tier, but it's not the worst thing I've ever read, and it's also not the worst R.L. Stine thing I've read. Honestly, I really do like R.L. Stine, but I think his forte is children's horror. That's where he really like succeeds. Almost all the Goosebumps books he's done. I can't even think of one. Okay, there are a couple, but most of them I would rate higher than 1.5. So I mean, but again, they're full books, so hard to compare. But I feel like Fear Street was not as strong. It was good, but some of them were also kind of weak. I feel some of the, but like Fear Street was made for a slightly older age, but then you got these, which it's short story. I think a lot of it has to do with the type of story because it's a short story. It doesn't quite work, but I mean it's still serviceable and it's readable. I'm not going to say don't read it. I'm going to say read it at your own risk. I think is a better way to say it. So, where can you get the Twilight Zone anthology? I believe I got mine at Barnes and Noble a while ago, but yeah, I would suggest getting this if you are a fan of '80s Twilight Zone, if you're a fan of horror, and when you think of Twilight Zone, you're more thinking of It's a Good Life rather than Time Enough at Last. If all three of those fit, your checklist, get this book. If it doesn't, I still would recommend this book, but you might be um, just for Rod and a couple of the others, their stories, but yeah, might be disappointed or thrown off by some of the other stories in the book. Anyway, so thank you for joining me on Literary Gladiators today. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and also please uh, subscribe to us on Patreon. If you can do that and become a member of Patreon, it helps our channel immensely. We've got a whole free for all, and we're going to be picking new works for possible brand new season soon. So um, we got a lot of things coming up. So thank you for tuning in, and I wanted to say keep reading.